Did you know that being just a foot below the base flood elevation could impact you by thousands of dollars? In fact, we saw it happen this week where a customer's flood insurance used to be $1,200 and the base flood elevation changed. Now it's $12,000. Crazy, isn't it? But that's exactly the impact it could have on you. But the good news is we're going to discuss in this video is how not to have this happen. And if it does happen, what you can do to minimize those costs. So let's get started. But before we do, share, subscribe, and like the channel below. Hi, I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and today we're talking about base flood elevation's impact on flood insurance costs. You know, we see from time to time when a base flood elevation will change, like you see right here behind me, where FEMA may come in and raise that base flood elevation because of flood threats in the area. Well, you may have had a house that was built 10, 15 years ago that was at a different base flood elevation, and now that's changed. Now you're being told that you're in a high-risk flood zone, and that flood insurance is going to be required. The problem is your flood insurance now is going to be $10,000 a year. Well, what can you do? Whether it be with the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as FEMA or NFIP, and private flood insurance. You see, private flood insurance and National Flood Insurance Program, elevation is one thing that they're looking at. And the further you are below that base flood elevation, the higher flood insurance costs you could have. And so you want to be cautious there. You want to find out what that base flood elevation is if you're looking at buying a property. This could help you understand long term. Now, there may be where you don't have a base flood elevation. If you live in flood zone A, that's a good possibility, as a lot of flood insurance study reports have not been done. And that's typically how a base flood elevation is determined, is through getting a flood insurance study report. It can take up to 5 years sometimes to determine one, as they're changing it from maybe a flood zone A to a flood zone AE. And we'll talk about that as we talk about flood zones and base flood elevation in our next video that you can click up here in the corner. But when it comes to cost, you can have a big impact. So what can you do here? Well, in many situations, you can look at raising your property above that base flood elevation, making sure there's no living space below that base flood elevation, like putting a house on piers or a crawl space that doesn't have any living space. Since FEMA looks at the first floor height down when determining flood insurance rates. So this is a couple of ways that you could impact your insurance cost here. We've even seen it where people decide to fill in a basement to change that base flood elevation. Now, it's important to understand that, FEMA is looking at changing these maps every 5 years if they can. Now, it could be that your base flood elevation goes down in a couple of years, depending on some mitigation things that your community may have done through sometimes called the community rating system, which is a program that they go above and beyond when doing mitigation, trying to lower the risk of flooding. Now, it's also important to look that different private companies are looking at risk differently. So if you go to the National Flood Insurance Program and you get a $5,000 rate because you're a foot below the base flood elevation, that does not mean your flood insurance costs are going to be $5,000 with a private flood insurance company. Could be only $2,000, could be $1,000. Each company is looking at rating differently. They're looking at this big pool of things like replacement costs, distance to water, like you see right here behind me, the type of flooding. Is it river flooding? Is it lake flooding? And how often is it happening? These are all things are going into a pool to determine that rate. So it's important to understand that base flood elevation is just a portion of how that rate's being determined. But another big factor could be replacement costs. So if you have a high replacement cost in your building and you're really far below that base flood elevation, these two factors could be red flags that you're going to have a high flood insurance premium. So these are things you want to think about if you're looking at buying a home or you're already living in a home. You're just trying to minimize your costs like everyone else is in 2025 and beyond. These are things you want to look at when it comes to base flood elevation. Now, in our next video, we're going to be talking about base flood elevation and flood zones. So make sure to stay tuned to that. And also make sure to stay tuned to the end of this playlist where we answer some of your most frequently asked questions when it comes to base flood elevation. Share, subscribe, and like the channel below. Thank you for watching.